I am here at the Bonner Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. We're hosting this webinar, which is profiling one model for teaching social action, the model that Scott Myers-Lipton, who's the other gentleman on the screen, and who's just published a book and has been teaching this course for more than a decade. And we're not going to be able to do introductions in the normal fashion. So let me just I'll give you the overview of the agenda, and then we'll just get started. I'm going to give a little background on the partnership. Then Scott will pick that up and walk through that for about 5 minutes. Then he'll do some more background on how he started the course, why he started it, how it's evolved, and then about 15 minutes walking through the course itself with the course syllabus. The book he's written mirrors that and is a reinforcement to that. He'll also explain that you can teach this method of social action in any number of course topics. So the courses could be on climate change, or a business course, or economic development, or any number of topics where the action you want students to take is a social action initiative. And he'll talk about that. We'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So my hope is that people will type their questions in the text box, so I'll collect those. Depending on how many we have, we'll either ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I'll read the question out. And then we'll spend about the last 5 minutes, and we will end promptly at 4 East Coast time. We'll spend the last 5 minutes talking about some of our next steps and our goals, which are, in fact, to have all of you either start a course yourself or find somebody on your campus to start a course, or multiple courses on your campus along these lines. Okay, so let me just begin with, in the sign-up for this, and I was getting people emailing me as late as yesterday. We literally have people from coast to coast and a whole bunch of folks in the middle of the country. In the email update, I did send a contact list, so you could find other people on your own campus in some cases. Cal State East Bay has a whole bunch of folks on the call, but you can see up and down the coast and a bunch of schools in the middle. So there's a bunch of people who are interested in this. I suspect some of you are already doing some of this kind of work, and we'd be interested in hearing about what you have been doing, and are very interested in working with you as we move forward. This is a pretty major initiative for the Bonner Foundation, one that we hope will spread among our network of schools. But the purpose of this call and other calls like this is to spread this to other schools well outside the Bonner community of schools. Just real briefly, the Bonner program, which the foundation supports, I should say, is on 65 campuses. It's a service-based scholarship program. It enables students who otherwise have to work or are working to pay their way through school to do that through community engagement work. It's a 4-year program, 10 hours a week. And as students develop through that, we're hoping that they have the opportunity not just to understand the issues, but know how to act on them in terms of changing policies, not just doing the hands-on direct service. So the working with Scott is bringing that to our network. And I should say, in many ways, at long last. Here in the room, so to speak, this virtual room, at least the initial signups, there were 76 folks who signed up, besides Scott, myself, and a young staffer, a member here. 26 of you are faculty members, and 50 were staff. And of the staff, 5 of them represent national networks. So, which is great for us, because that means those folks hopefully will get the word out to some others. The Cal State headquarters office, I'm not sure how what you call it, clearly did an email out, because there's a bunch of CSU schools on the call, which we're really pleased about. So that's kind of the quick background from me. I'm going to be the scrolling person and the time check. So I'm going to pass this on to Scott and just scroll the screen down. Again, if you have any questions, please type them on the email, on that chat box. All right, Scott, take it away.
Great. So thank you, Bobby. And what I'm here to do is to give you, in the first part of my talk, is to tell you like how did I get to the thinking around the book, the kind of background, and then like what are the major components of the book, and then move into actually the book itself. So I wanted to start with my early interest in social action, and I put in there in 1988. I took a class called Motivated to Serve at Stanford when I was a grad student at SF State, and I put it in there not to say how old I am, which I am older, but to show that that there was a movement of college students in the 1980s, and there was a group of us all around the country, kind of best represented by the COOL, Campus Opportunity Outreach League, but on college campuses of how to engage in the era of Ronald Reagan, and this idea that there was not an interest in civic engagement of the youth in the 1980s, which was not an accurate description, right? So I took this class, was very excited about it, and then took that interest and then combined it with another interest around peace. I was doing a master's degree looking at Gandhi and King at SF State, and took it. There was and melded it with an idea from Father Ted Hesburgh, and some of you might know that name. He was the president emeritus of Notre Dame University, and he was on the Civil Rights Commission, and he called for colleges to develop what he called peace ROTC programs, training to do peace and justice, just like we do in ROTC, scholarships and academic classes and engagement, but for non-military. I thought that was the greatest idea. I was lucky enough to meet with him, said, Father Ted, what's your vision around this? And he said, I don't know. I just know it's the right idea. You should go out and do it. So that's what I did. I spent really the majority of my middle age doing that. I created 3 different programs. We changed the name because Peace ROTC was hated by both the left and the right. So we changed it to International National Voluntary Service Training. And I developed 3 programs at these 3 universities: CU Boulder, St. Mary's College, and at San Jose State. CU Boulder is still going on, which is awesome, and it trains people in the model that we developed. But in 2005, I had a year off to write a book, and I decided when I came back, I was going to change what I was doing with Invest, training leaders to do social action over a 2-year period, to do it in one class. And I did that for a lot of reasons, which I'm glad to share at some point. But I decided to end my work with Invest and do it in one class, and I created this class called Social Action, where in one semester, students could have a kind of a hands-on experience with actually doing social action rather than talking about it or theorizing about it. So that's a short history of like, how did I get to where I am and where, how the book got, written, because the book is the last decade of my work, and kind of everything that I learned and I've learned in that class is in that book. And so we'll talk more about that. So my goals for writing the book, Bobby asked me to say that, again, I want to give students, not just because I was doing it in my class, but around the nation, a chance to have a firsthand experience to do social action. Again, not just to talk about it, not to theorize about it, but to do it. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, not just critical thinking, but the empowerment that comes out of it, the student leadership that develops out of it. And then in the social sciences, kind of a direct, dealing with power and how power operates. So I wanted to, in my discipline in sociology, we have every campus has a social problems class. And I really wanted to move my discipline away from just social problems to social solutions being centerfold. So the class could have been called social solutions. It was called social action for other reasons, which we can talk about. But really, it's a class on social solutions. And also, this is obviously a unique time in our history. And I really feel that, and I hope you all agree, is that our students at this time are looking for ways to engage in the community and look for effective ways to engage in the community. So this book, I think, is obviously, hopefully timely for the time period we're in in the youth time in our country. So my goals in partnering with the Bonner Network, many, we have a commitment of 5 to 7 Bonner schools to start this class in the fall. I'm hoping out of this, our discussion today and in the weeks and the months to come, that 5 or 7 more of you would be interested in joining those Bonner schools. And then we'd have, a group of 10, 12 or so, 14 classes up and started in the fall. that's I think Bobby's and my hope is that we get this small group of early adopters who are going to take this idea of social action. And it could be across, as Bobby said, I teach in sociology. Last semester as a manuscript, I sent the manuscript out. Many of you might have even gotten that manuscript. But 2 faculty, one at college in New Jersey and one at in environmental studies, who's an anthropologist, and one in business at the Monterey Institute, connected to Middlebury College, taught that in his business course. So my hope is that it's taught throughout the disciplines, because while it's a method of social action and change, it can be taught in any of the disciplines. You know, the hope in the future is that we have this much greater, that there's 60 social action courses being taught, and in 5 years, I don't know how many outside the network, but at least in the network, all Bonner campuses would have this social action experience possible for the students. So let me explain a little bit about the order of the book and of the course, right? So I would just say that there's this balance always with students of action and reflection, is that what I have found, and I used a variety of books over the last decade, and many of you are probably familiar, everything going back to Midwest Academy's Organize! ! So my book, Change, the exclamation mark that was the first book I used, so it's kind of giving props to that very first book of Organize! ! By Midwest Academy. But Stir It Up by Renku Sen, I've used, by Joan Maneri's book on tools for radical democracy. And some of these books are probably, if you're familiar with the literature, you've used them too. But what I found is that those books are not written for college campuses. This book is. So just, for example, the book starts off with issue development. In most of those books, it's chapter 5 or 6. But if you're going to do a class in social action and you want them to do it, that's the first thing you have to do. So issue development, choosing the issue that the students are going to work on. But once they choose that, it takes a couple of weeks for them to do that. There can be reflection going on about that topic and some other topics that are connected to change. And so that's the balance. There is an action expected of the students, and then there's some time to reflect and analyze, and then action. So we don't overwhelm students with giving them 5 different actions to do. So I already explained by the next thing, on issue development, this next section is on leadership and change theory. My students just went through that. I think I'll wait till the later part to talk about that, but my students just went through it and had a great experience. So you get the sense of action, reflection, and then recruitment, another big action that the students do in building power. And then research. So this flow back and forth between action and reflection. And if you're familiar with Paulo Freire in the Pedagogy of Press, he talks about this very important notion of praxis and theory. And so it's based in this Freirean model of how we learn. And again, a kickoff event, again, an action. So action, reflection. So that's how the book is ordered. I would also say the other part of the book is that one class, generally we have one, in the last semester we won 2 campaigns in the semester, which is kind of unique. Generally it takes a couple of years to win. And so the class, and we could talk about this, my class is taught every semester, but my vision of it is that there might be 3 or 4 of these classes going on a college campus eventually, and that students might be working on the campaigns, not just in one class, but in many, and that so the campaigns don't die over the time that it needs to actually, quote unquote, win the campaign. You might ask in the next point, what do students do during class? So 30 minutes are with discussion of the course material, so an analysis of the book. 30 minutes are generally in reflecting about, there are questions at the end of each chapter that they need to be thinking about to get both on the action reflection component. So they're in there doing those questions in their small group, really developing their campaign plan in that, and all that's composed of that. We'll talk about that maybe in a second. And then in 15 minutes, we use students all do an organizational wrap. So they learn their organizational wrap. We teach them how to do it. So we're always practicing organizational wraps in the last 10 or 15 minutes, or we're having some issue with a group that wants to talk. And so the last 10 or 15 minutes is used for them to talk to the larger 4 or 5 campaigns, because generally there's 3 to 5 campaigns of a class of 30 or 40 that are going on. Right now we have 4 campaigns, which is kind of normal. And then I think what's kind of really exciting, at the end of the whole class, the students create a notebook. We call it the sacred text. They create a notebook of the evaluation of all the things they've done, theoretically, practically, their research, their recruitment. They do an analysis of that, and then that notebook, which is graded, gets handed down to the next generation of students if they decide to pick up the campaign, because this is very much student driven. I come in, we'll talk about that issue development. I don't generate, I bring in community members who've heard about the opportunity to get students maybe to work on their campaign. So that happens on that first day. Plus they come up with their own ideas for change. And we then connect to community groups that are working on that. And I could talk a little bit more about that in issue development. But that book is key because it's kind of their sacred text, we call it, because it's their knowledge that they've generated. And why they're so excited about that. And when I handed it off to the new students taking on a campaign, I was like, look, here's the sacred text for this campaign, and you are gonna make it even better because you're gonna add to it. Like, there is a level of excitement around education that they might not have had for, since they've been in kindergarten or first grade, when they're asked about, a question, they're all raising their hands. That's the kind of excitement we create, I think, by doing this kind of very meaningful type of education. What teachers can do, there's, and I'm glad to say, and I'm not sure if you've seen my syllabus, but there is more time. It's only one book. It's, I think, it's 160 pages. It's not, 300 or 400 pages. So you have other time in your classes to do other things. Other people, like I said, use it for the business principles or for the environmental principles that they're teaching. I happen to use it around economic rights. That either student campaigns or other campaigns have gone on. I teach around that, but you could do whatever you wanted in that other time period. So Bobby, I can go on the issue of, kind of go through the chapters, but do you want to take any questions about what I said right now?
Yeah, I will. And so if you want to either unmute yourself or maybe type a question in the chat room, you can type your question anytime. One thing I want to point out is that Scott is not suggesting that people teach these courses exactly the way he teaches.
No.
Having said that, the reason this order makes sense, like you said, about issue development, it makes a big difference. Miriam Shakow, who's the faculty member at the College of New Jersey, who taught a freshman seminar on climate change, her students, she's done it a couple times, and she felt this was really changed the whole game because they had a structure and a pacing to get this done more quickly. I'm just gonna go ahead and keep scrolling down, Scott, and
okay. You left me. Hello.
Scott, you're all set. Just go ahead and go.
Go. Okay, you left. So good.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the hopes of the book is it provides a framework, but I think one of the things that is incredibly important, right, with faculty that are teaching this is that they have their own way of doing it and instructing their class and their course material, and all that can be brought to bear. I think this provides just kind of the framework, kind of demystifies like how to do social action / community organizing in a class. So I think that's the hope. So let's talk about the various chapters, and I'll just kind of go through them, and maybe I get maybe halfway through and I can stop because there's 10 chapters, and I'll try to go through them at least to give you a sense of the key issues of each chapter. Excuse me. So chapter 1 starts off with issue development. And again, as I said, most of the other books, they start in chapters 5 and 6. So I realized that had to be, so I would just start my classes with chapter 6. In this case, you don't have to do that because it's kind of taking the best of those lessons and bringing the bear in this book. So one of the things that, just to differentiate, is between an individual problem, a social problem, and an issue. And most of our students, at least in sociology and the social sciences, they get the difference between individual problem and social problem, but they don't get the difference between an issue. And that's the additive part. Like, they get that there are problems in our society that, whether it's poverty or racism, that look at institutions and look at whether it be economic and political institutions and how people, how the system operates to marginalize various groups, for example. But when it comes to issues, they don't, and solutions. So they're very excited about the possibility of like working on an issue, because an issue, let me just kind of go through them. And I would say this, usually that's done in 4 to 10 weeks, an issue development, sometimes, 3 months, but we don't have 3 months because that's a whole semester. So we do it in a couple of weeks. So I tell them it's a little bit, it's truncated, the process, but it still seems to work pretty well. And I go through that issue development process in the book. But the key thing for the students is that they know that it has a solution. There's a specific demand that's concrete, it's measurable. And I'll just give you an example. My students wanted, after 3 students had fainted in one building because of the heat, 90-degree heat, and there was no air conditioning. We're a working class institution. The building's 70 years old. There's 4,000 students in it. They didn't go to the administration and say, we want air conditioning. The demand was, we want air conditioning in every room in Dudley Moorhead Hall at the cost of $3 million, because they had done the research, how much it's going to cost. And we want it done in the next year. Do you say yes or no to that? So a very specific demand, rather than if you went to an administrator and say, we want air conditioning, of course we want it, but we can't do it for these reasons. So you get them to say, this very, very clear yes or no. And generally I say they're going to say no. And in that case, of course they said no. But after a 3-year campaign of identifying a target and putting various levels of pressure on that, they changed their mind and said yes. So that's what the book is about, right? How to get someone who says no to say yes to the demand of the people here. A target, so it's identifying a target, the lowest ranking person who has the ability to make that decision. So they identify a target and they do a target analysis around that person. Of course, they have to feel strongly about it and willing to fight for it. And we have a lot of conversations about that as they go out in the community, they try it in the student body. And if there's not that level of interest, we ask them to rethink their issue. Maybe it's not a good issue, or maybe the message they're saying is not the right way to say it. And then, of course, is it winnable? Can they do it within a time frame that's reasonable, rather than 10 or 15 years? Maybe, the longest we've kind of taken on is a year to 2 years over a time period. So, and then I give a bunch of case studies in that issue development, and they just get super excited because I had probably 40 different campaigns that have run in the last 11 years, 12 years doing this class. And I give them examples from the students from campus for campus safety and the students for racial equality, the minimum wage campaign, which we're known the most because our students led that campaign. They're the ones that came up with the idea. They had built the coalition of labor, faith, and nonprofits. And our students at San Jose State, with that coalition, with a ballot measure in 2012, raised the minimum wage from $8 to $10 and now pushed it to $15 by 2019. So that effort is what we're known for at San Jose, but we've had 11 other victories besides that. But it's the one that people always say, oh yeah, you guys are the minimum wage guys, gals. Setting the tone is chapter 2. And I just think that here's an example. So they're doing issue development, right? They're in the process. And what's fun about that is I have community groups come in. So the PICO network, if you're familiar with PICO, they came in and they're working on a police brutality campaign, or, issues around kind of Black Lives Matter. And they presented. Our students didn't choose that, but they presented. Another group came in and presented from the community about their issue. And then the previous students presented as well. And then students in the class had their ideas. So there was this dialogue for over 2 or 3 classes. What campaign are they going to do? And then my job is to then, in this next phase, in that part of issue development, start connecting them to the stakeholders in the community. So I serve as that guide on the side, connecting them to the stakeholders in the community that are already working on that issue or have an interest in that issue. So, we're not duplicating efforts by any stretch. We're figuring out who else is working on these issues. Setting the tone is key because it gets at the question of what I say is a definition of leadership, which is more inclusive than kind of a charismatic speaker. And my definition is, is actually from the Rocky Mountain Peace Center, which says someone who thinks about the group and helps it function effectively. And once they get around that, like they think about the group and they help it function effectively, it opens it up to everyone becoming a leader rather than just 1 or 2 of the, kind of outspoken people. we have a discussion in that early part of the class, is change possible? And that's really important, because even though my students know change is possible because they've read about the civil rights or the women's movement, the civil rights struggle, do they think it's possible for them? And that's actually why I started the whole book with the student victories, because I wanted to show up front that if you use an effective model, you can actually have victories. So I wanted to put that up, but we have a really long conversation about that. And I talk about leadership skills that are necessary, whether it be the small group skills, the persistence that's necessary, the active listening, the ability to, I say no with a smile, because they're going to be, once they become effective and seen as effective, people are going to then ask them to be on their campaign and how to deal with not being overburdened and overwhelmed by your success. I start every class off, if you remember Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, I start there because I think it's a great place for our students. The modern day vision maybe is the matrix, but I have students to reflect on where are we as a people, and are we in the cave, as Plato asserts. So that's a kind of a fun campaign. The third chapter is on, again, this, while they're still doing issue development, still getting their issue, concretized and getting it really focused down on a target and figuring out what is a concrete measurable request. They're doing this change theory perspective too. So I have them learn about kind of large scale macro theory change, community organizing, and the book focuses on first on women-centered. If you're familiar with the literature, Alinsky is generally the model that's held up as kind of the founding. And so, but I kind of like, and really thanks to Randy Stoker and his colleague, focus on the women-centered model first, both with kind of white women in the 19th century looking at the Hull House movement, the Settle House movement, and their idea of empowerment, and also looking at going back to bell hooks' work and looking at home place as a site of resistance of enslaved African Americans and their perspective, kind of through the Women's Black Council up to Ella Baker and Joanne Robinson, of these much more group-centered, group-focused, rather than having kind of a militaristic, very kind of male, masculine type of model of community organizing. And I argue that we need kind of both, an integration of these models. And I just showed my students Joanne Robinson from the Montgomery bus boycott and Saul Alinsky, and compared those two, and we showed 2 videos of them, and the students just love that. I also highlight functionalists, functionalist theory, if you're familiar with that, and conflict theory of education, and how it relates to our area of service learning. So, and this notion of human agency and schools as a site of resistance. The next chapter focuses on building power, which is now they're kind of ready to do something again. We're in my class, we're in the 3rd week. So they've gone through the process of developing their issue. My students are working on 4 campaigns. If you're interested, I can tell you about what they are, but there are 4 campaigns they're working on right now. I'll just say one is a janitor's campaign. Our janitors are paid minimum wage on our campus, and they want to get them a living wage. So that's one of them. Another is to change the policy to allow rooftop gardens on our for climate change on our buildings. A third is to it's called erase. They want to get rid of the use of the word race on campus and use ethnic identity rather than race. And then the fourth is to stop the sweeps that are going on in our community, of the homeless sweeps. We have 7,000 people homeless in our community, in our county, but they sweep them and they have nowhere to go. So they keep sweeping them all over the city. So those are the 4 campaigns that the students have chosen. And now they're in the place to build power. So what are they doing? Right? We talk about first of all, how do they feel about power? Because most of my students are like, I'm not so sure about power. They've had bad experiences with it, but then we define it. And once they go through these definitions of power over, power with, and power for, they get empowered about them, and they understand the difference of the 3 and how power over can actually be a positive if you're in a Alinsky kind of model and you're trying to have a marginalized group having power over the elite who's forcing maybe not such good policies on people who have been marginalized, and power with very much aligned with the women-centered organizing of working in kind of small groups around leaderful movements and places of offering kind of human empowerment in their group. So very good group dynamics and good facilitation, good consensus decision-making. So the part that gets to also is how to get power. I'm going to skip how it manifests itself. Obviously, we're educated about organized people, even though I do talk about organized money and organized violence. organize people. So that's a real focus. That's the class. It's like, how do we organize people? And being organized, I say, one part is forming your group. So you have an organizing committee. That's the beginning of getting power. The second part is starting to recruit people to the campaign. So they're now in the process of recruiting students to their campaign. And then that is fun because they have to learn how to do an organizational wrap. And that then leads to them going into a decision around getting more knowledge around the history, because they realize, wow, I know some things, but I need to know more. That's the next chapter on the history of their problem and the target analysis and the power map that they do the next class. So they build that base. And so everything from getting a sign-up sheet together to get I have a couple of tables they can go borrow, to getting signs made, to getting, going into classrooms and starting to recruit and they actually create a recruitment team, which, by the way, I've had my students then use that on their for their vita, for the resume, that they were the co-coordinator of the recruitment team to raise the minimum wage. And that is a great way for them to get jobs in the future, because they actually have done something. They've done something that's actually quite powerful. Leads to research, I talk about, right? Historical analysis, target analysis, and power mapping. I won't say very much about that other than say that's really where the campaign is won or lost, because knowledge is power. So that is super important too, that the students have they know more about it than anyone else, is what I say, that they have to be on these three issues. It leads to strategy and tactics, which this is really the beginning of the kind of like, they're going to start their campaign. They've recruited people to actually do something, and now they got to figure out what they want to do. And so I go over the various possibilities, of strategies. Do they want, an administrative system to change or create a new public program? Do they want a new law change, right? Again, back to the issue development. Are they going to do it through a media and public education strategy? Are they going to have disruption? Is there going to be, nonviolent public action that disrupts day-to-day schedules? So it's talked about. And then tactics, right? Direct negotiation with the target. Do they going to have accountability sessions, a lobby day, a day in the life of trying to get your target to experience, let's say, the sweeps and what's it like to be homeless, do a public hearing with the target, or a direct meeting with the target. And we just won a campaign on getting the university to become part of the Workers' Rights Consortium. My students led that campaign, and they had a head-on-head meeting with first the chief of staff and of the president, and then the president. And she just signed on about a month ago to become part of the Workers' Rights Consortium, which is part of the United Students Against Sweatshop movement. I think, the rest I could talk about, but I think I maybe stop there. But, you can then, there's this campaign kickoff, which is super exciting, usually kind of a press conference that goes on. We call the press, and usually we have by that time met with the target and asked them to change their mind if they've taken a position. Generally, they say no, they're not going to change their mind. And so then we do a campaign kickoff. And then we try to bring as many public people to that event as possible. And for this last one, for the sweatshop issue, we had the head of the NAACP there. We had the labor unions there. And the president's office got so nervous that there was all this activity with all these students on the campus. The chief of staff came out with all the media there, invited the students into a meeting right there with the cameras rolling. That was all on the press. And then, 4 weeks later, met with the students and then changed her position, which was she was initially not going to join the WRC. And there's just a ton of learning that students learn about how to do a press release, how to work with the media. We create a media relations team, and that's just all. They just have a great time with that campaign kickoff. Generally, you don't win the campaign after your campaign kickoff, even though you put a lot of pressure on the people. We have won a lot right after the campaign kickoff. But then if they still say no, then we go into the actual process of kind of the rest of the campaign, which is these kind of series of actions that the students take, whether they be rallies or marches or other types of the actions I talked about to move the target. So I can say more about the group dynamics and so forth, and then the evaluation at the end. But I think I'll stop and just to see what kind of questions you have, because I don't want to spend the whole time talking.
All right, Scott. A couple questions here. So let me just read them out loud. Probably the easiest right now. So Kira Velasco, I might be saying his name wrong, says, how much does the book dive into curricular elements of the class? i.e. discussion prompts and activities, assessment of learning, and accomplishments of course objectives. Let me actually start by answering that. We are going to be developing a teacher's guide, or maybe we're going to call it a field guide, that provides those very things. And so we're going to have, and we'll start with Scott's class because Scott's available. But as other folks started doing this, Kelly Benkert at Northwestern and others who we've met, we're going to be trying to gather their material. How do they teach these exercises in the classes, and sharing that material. We'll start probably on the Bonner Wiki. Maybe at some point we can get it published in some form, but that very resource. This book is great for the students to read, but it doesn't really tell the faculty member how to teach it. It does have the questions, but it doesn't go into those other components you're bringing up. Scott, you want to add anything to that?
You know what? I was actually reading. I thought you were going to handle it. I was reading the next question.
All right. Well, go ahead and take it.
So most of the campaigns are connected with local organizations, right? Or with I would say campus/local, right? So if you look at the ones this semester, they're working with the students, with other student organizations. So I would say the students themselves, maybe half of the projects are working with just on the campus, which I think has all sorts of positives, because there's a lot to change. Students feel a lot of, it's their direct thing that they're experiencing. So, and it's the closest sense of, it's the easiest to change because it's right there. So when the students work with other organizations, this is on the CSU question that I'm looking at. So they connect they become like the student wing of the group. So we have not the service learning to fill out those forms. The service learning center, which we go through, they know the students, like we fill out the hours of what they're doing, but they don't work for those organizations. So we get around that way. So we don't have the students, because they're not working for the organizations. They're the students organizing on the campus. They're in alliance with that organization, but they're not part of our organization. So, and I would say it's both of those are powerful models to have them work on the campus or with the community. And sometimes they've done even national. I mean, the biggest one was the Gulf Coast. After Katrina, we worked, with 50 other campuses trying to get a major public works project for the Gulf Coast, and got 43 co-sponsors on the bill. But my students were kind of in the lead of that on college campuses. So, but again, working in close alliance with community organizations.
Okay, Scott. Amy Quartz is asking, how do you deal with student disagreement on an issue?
So if the students, what's great about it is that the students are in that, they come up with them themselves, right? So let's say there was probably, in this case, in this class I'm teaching right now, probably 15 different ideas. And after the first class or two, there was a group of students who already made their mind. So I actually said, if you already made your mind up, then you can start. And I gave them a series of questions to start thinking about. And then I dealt with there was 11 left of that. And there was probably 10 different ideas up on the board around what issue they could join. And I said, obviously, all 10 of you can't join these 10 organizations because you have to have a minimum of 3 to start a campaign. So I said, we're gonna have to narrow it down. And so we just brainstormed with the students and tried to figure out where is their passion. And there was and out of that process, we had the students narrow it down to 3. One student was still unhappy. And I said, look, you can still try to peel off other group members. Now, in the past, when students have done that, they actually have been successful. They've been able to peel off a couple of people to join their campaign. In fact, the USAS campaign was created after like the 5th class because someone was not feeling the other 4 projects that had started. She wanted to do this, and she made a plea, and 2 other students left. And I just think you want to make the students feel that they can move between campaigns, particularly in this beginning, 5, 6, 7 classes. And I actually say, even if you find a campaign mid-level, mid-semester, you want to change, you can change, because they just now pick it up there, and then they start working on that campaign. They'll be a little behind the curve, but I want students to feel like they're doing their passion rather than, having to follow along with, not me, what I said, but what other students are saying.
Yeah. Scott, Darby is asking, what happens, because you've had some students this semester win their campaigns early.
Yeah, so here's the thing is that, and I talk about in that power section, they win a campaign. So the students against sexual assault, SOSH, they won their campaign. I would say, we had a faculty member on the CS on our campus that had sexually harassed a student, for sure. Was convicted of that by the administration, by our committee structure, and the penalty was 2 weeks non-paid, and then come back to class, and then they could come back to teach, and they'd have to also do 2 weeks or do a series of sexual harassment training. The students thought that was not acceptable in this Me Too era. Time's up. They led a campaign. They won that probably, I would say, maybe half to 2/3 of the way through. But there were that was their one demand, but they had 2 other demands. That's why there's usually not usually, but usually an issue has 2 or 3 demands. And the second one was to get a student onto that committee that made that decision that allowed that person back. And the third one was to actually change the way the CSU is doing sexual harassment training. So there was 2 other demands. And then after they won, they held a victory party, because you always should celebrate. It was a big event on our campus. It got a ton of press on the victory party for not having this professor come back. And then they started working on these other demands, and they tried to turn it over to the next group of students, but there was no interest. So then that book of their work stays on my shelf, and we'll bring it back the next semester and say, hey, there's this campaign that you could pick up if you want, but you don't have to, obviously. And there's a series of those that sit on my cabinet, and I bring them up, and if they don't want to take them, they don't take them.
All right, Scott, we have 10 more minutes, and there's 5 more questions, but just keep that in mind.
I got it.
So Mary Case asked, how do you make sure that the campaigns are community-identified needs and avoid the white savior complex?
Gotcha. Well, so most of my students are students of color, so I just want to say that. It's a working class institution at San Jose State. So we talk about privilege for sure, and talk about quote unquote saving, and that we're interested in justice, not saving. So we can have that conversation. We do have that conversation. But the community identified needs are, a lot of them are coming out of if they're working on the campus, they are the community, right? But they need to go out and find out if it resonates with other people. So they do stakeholder meetings and interviews too. So they're doing interviews of students to find out and asking questions. What do you think of that? So those are 2 ways to do it. When it's off the community, like stopping the sweeps, there's a series in San Jose of kind of like 5 to 10 of the major leaders they're talking to right now. And what's amazing about it is that when those groups are, my experience has been incredibly excited to have students engaged on this, because one, student energy is there's this positive energy of having the students. But I think the key question is that to work in alliance with those organizations, like they're not going to run off on a side and do something that the respected leadership has said that we're going this way. So we're allies with the community, and we're very sensitive to the fact that because a lot of those leaders are homeless or have been homeless themselves. So we're not coming in to save, we're coming in to be allies with. And there's this very powerful dialogue, because they become kind of the student wing part of those campaigns, all very positive. Hasn't been a negative.
Okay, Scott, we have 2 questions back to back. It's basically the same question, but I'll read both of them.
Yep.
Do you have pushback from either administrators on the campus or community organizations that are working on the issues in different ways? So that's one question. And then how do you maintain, this second one has to do with the administration. How do you maintain support to teach this course when your course causes pressure on the administration to make change?
So I would say, twofold. I mean, one is in the very beginning when I started teaching this class, and then our students, started becoming, they became aware that the class was being taught. I got the call, right? I got the call from the dean. And so I came in and I showed the dean my curriculum, that I'm teaching about democracy, that I'm not I'm not shoving down my theoretical perspective down their throat, that the students have total choice in what they're doing, and the students, it's their passion, not mine. And so when I went through that process, the dean says, I've got your back, no worries, you're not gonna have a problem. That said, the same dean called me after the student, this last campaign, because the students were, there was a lot of press there, and they were, putting pressure on the president. So the dean said, how did that happen? Like, do you want to know, like, the process? And I said, well, the students went over to the president, asked the president to meet. They did it, 6 times. There was no thought. They didn't even respond to their emails. They went there personally. There was a response, and they said, we're not going to support that. We've made our decision. So at that point, once the dean heard there was all this, they weren't just going off on the side. They went through the process. He was like, fine, I'm totally fine with that. I think the university just wants to make sure that it's not being done irresponsibly. And I think even though it does take, I'm not going to deny it, will create discomfort, because we are putting pressure, and the students are putting pressure on the administration or the campus or the community, right?
So Scott, I didn't read the last part of one of these questions, which is, it's probably, and we may not have time to sort of delve into this because a couple more questions, but I think the sensitivity here in part is that as a tenured faculty member, you may have more protections than a staff member.
Absolutely.
Organizing these same kind of campaigns.
I think that's true. I mean, obviously, being a full professor with tenure, there is protection. I think, but I think if you go to, and in fact, I'll give you another example. I mean, twofold. I invited the dean. The students wanted to, I was talking about the dean. They wanted to meet him. We invited the dean into the class. He's coming on Tuesday to speak to the students. So I just think you have open communication, so you're not doing something in the dark over here, and they don't know it's not happening. So I'd say as much as you can keep people in process, and we're teaching about democracy. And I would argue, as I do in the beginning of the book, and my message to the teachers, who are teaching this, is that we on a college campus are doing all sorts of community engagement in our business classes, that people are out in business programs or in businesses working on ideas around business. So to me, this is no different than doing that when it comes to democracy. And so, but I understand the discomfort, but I generally have been able to get the administration to support it rather than be opposed.
Okay, the next question is, have you or anyone else so far had success in doing this across multiple courses? Maybe even sequence courses. I know you teach your course fall and spring, so there is a continuity there.
Yeah, I see it come from Dave. So Dave, we're trying, I just had a meeting with 2 other professors on our campus at San Jose State last week, and we're going to try to develop multiple courses, because if it's taught in Mexican American studies, the book anyway, and they're doing, they have that focus on, let's say, Mexican American studies, but they're doing social action, our students could actually maybe then work on campaigns together, and that issue development might be early on together, right? So, or if it's taught environmental studies and other departments. So I think that's where I'd like to see it happen. Once we get a place to do it on a campus, that we do multiple courses. And I think for the long, then you're not feeling, you're burning out, or if you don't teach it that semester, it still can happen if for whatever reason the teacher doesn't teach that semester.
Okay. Do students stay involved in campaigns after the course ends?
Absolutely. Students do stay involved. So I think that, not all students, I let them know right up, there's not an expectation you stay involved. The class ends and you're not, but they do. But I think more importantly, my students have gone on to be involved in the leadership in Santa Clara County, in the political community world. And that's the exciting thing. They work for Sacred Heart. They become a community organizer at Sacred Heart, the biggest anti-poverty organization here in the South Bay. They work in political offices. They've helped run the mayor's campaign. So they're very engaged, because how many students know all the city council members? If my students are working on a campaign that has to do with the city, they get to know the vast majority of those city council members, and they know all of them by name. And that's the part of democracy I'm talking about. We talk about it a lot, but we don't give people a chance to actually be involved in it. And this does allow that.
Great. Okay. Last 2 questions. One is, how do you address this potential challenge? Students may come up with a solution, before they understand the complexity of the issue. For example, what's been tried before? Students might think there's a simple solution, and usually solutions are not simple.
Yeah. So I would just say there's, you know, and I think, so all, one, twofold. One, my students have been, you know, so I really encourage juniors and seniors to take the class. And by the time they come into my class, they've actually had a lot of classes on the social problems. So they come in, they don't come in like, you know, without thinking about issues. So they know, you know, they've taken the courses in social sciences. So they come in, but they have not talked about solutions. So in that chapter 5, I do a historical analysis, and I say, look at, in the last 100, 150 years, what has been the solutions proposed? So yeah, they've got this idea, and it's got to be a little bit that way, because if you're going to get students involved, you got to do it up front. So there is a downside of that. I recognize that. But in that historical analysis, they get around the complexity of those issues and understand that. At the same time, you know, my experience has been that if they do stakeholder interviews and they do the reading and they come in prepared, we don't have that issue of like them being like way out of bounds. In my experience.
Okay, so we have one last question. We don't have 5 minutes to answer it though, because we only have 5 minutes left. So yep. It's a little bit. It actually follows on the last question very closely. Do you involve elders who have been invested in an issue for years to be involved? If so, how? I'm thinking about the short timeline for determining the campaign, and it seems it would be difficult to get stakeholders invested and build trust between elders and students that quickly.
Well, here's the thing. So we've done this class, and this is our 12th year. Is every community organizer in San Jose, Santa Clara County knows about this class. They know what the students have done. And because they had such a big win on the minimum wage, they are seen as they're allowed in more quickly. So that's one. Now, I know that's not the case in others, but in those early years, my experience has been the elders want to help, and absolutely we invite quote unquote elders in. Now, sometimes the elders who have been involved for 5 or 10 years are my students who've now gone through the class and have gone out. So those are kind of like, they're not total elders, but we definitely have some of the major leaders come talk to the students and invite them in the class. So I would say absolutely super important. And as you teach this class over time, that level of trust builds, because they know that they're not just out, you know, running, you know, blind, that there's, and you as a facilitator, as a professor, have to obviously provide that space for them to make those, you know, good decisions. So I think that's part of the process.
Awesome. Well, I'm back on the screen. We have 4 minutes left. And so I just want to talk a little about next steps. We, Scott and I, are pretty much tied at the hip. We've been talking weekly about how to move this stuff forward for almost a year and a half now. We had a retreat a year ago, February, in the Sequoia, a retreat center that he's actually involved with. We had him out to last year's Bonner Summer Leadership Institute. We're going to have him back out. We had him come to our fall directors meeting. Part of what we're seeing is that people who might do this or considering it, or even bringing it or planning to do it, would benefit from a field guide or a teacher's guide. So we're going to work on that, collect examples of teaching methods and answer some of these other questions that are posed here, and try to gather those from other faculty who are doing this. We have a listserv we set up, and I'll email that out to everybody on this list to see if you want to join. Just a place to pose questions and stay in touch with folks. Scott's available for direct conversation, and that's actually the very first thing I would recommend most of you do, is email Scott and ask him some more questions and talk about your situation and what might work there. This June 5th to 8th in Wagner College on Staten Island, we're going to hold our Summer Leadership Institute. If there are enough people in it who want to do it, we will have I think a 2-day workshop, working session with faculty and staff who want to teach this. So it will be almost a separate track at that meeting. for face-to-face working time. Probably come in one day, leave, come in one day and stay a night, maybe stay 2 nights, we'll see. Scott's put his information up on the a chat room. And as I said, we're going to be putting more material on the website. So we're hoping that we want to build a movement out of this, not just within the Bonner Network, but more nationally. There are other folks. Scott's going to be on a panel with Randy Stoker and Marshall Gantz at the big sociology conference. I think it's in a year or so. We feel that it's time for this. And this particular approach, which is having students not just learn how to do it, but do it, is the thing that's very compelling to me and very, very compelling to the students at the Bonner meetings that we've spoken to. And having somebody with lots of experience and more of you who have experience sharing with each other will make it, I think, a lot less intimidating and feel like it's very possible. It reminds me of the early service learning days and the early days when we were doing community-based research, in that this doesn't have to be taught only in a course on social action. This method, these kind of actions can be done in all kinds of courses with actions tied to that issue. And I think Scott's template for doing that is excellent. And I'm hoping that others can adapt it, and we'll learn and we'll share various approaches for doing this. If not in a course, then perhaps in a workshop series. And I think Kelly Bankert at Northeastern has been doing that kind of model. I think at Stanford, they've done something similar. So that's our time for today. Thanks very much for everybody for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you. Take care.